All right, so it's officially 10:04, so we're going to get started out of respect of your time. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today as we go through a presentation, Recruitment and Retention of Behavioral Healthcare Professionals of Color, Analysis of Focus Group Findings. My name is Joseph Williams. I am currently Associate Professor at the University of Virginia. I wanted to start by thanking Glenn Cora and the leadership team for the opportunity to present the research findings. And again, without the work of Glencore, this wouldn't really be possible. And so again, thank you to the leadership team for the opportunity to review the findings with you all. All right, so before we actually get officially into the presentation mode, just wanted to kind of set a few things in terms of ground rules. One of the things that we're going to try to do throughout the presentation is address questions, and maybe actually should reframe that and say that towards the end of the presentation, we're actually going to get into a Q&A session. And so if you have questions at any point throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A icon that's available on your toolbar to actually type in your questions, and then we'll actually address those questions towards the end of our presentations. So again, thank you again for participating, and let me queue up our presentation to move forward. Right. And so basically what we're going to see is that this presentation actually summarizes focus group findings that were actually conducted as part of the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services initiatives, right? So these findings are actually based on focus group interviews conducted by myself, who represents a firm consultant, over a 2-month period in 2020, right? And so focus groups were actually used to explore the experiences of behavioral healthcare professionals of color working in public service sectors in Virginia. The goal was actually to gain insight into the ways that DBHDS can better retain and recruit racial and ethnic behavior healthcare professionals and create more inclusive environments for these staff members and their clients who self-identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, right? And so in all, there were 10 focus groups that were conducted with Black, Indigenous, and people of color in terms of behavioral healthcare professionals across the state of Virginia. And so it's the feedback from the focus groups interview, which we hope will be used to kind of fuel or inform future DBHDS initiatives. And so there's a few things that I would love for us to actually get out of our time today in terms of the agenda. One is just, I want to give you a brief overview of the focus group process, some of the logistics behind it. Also, please know that at the conclusion of this presentation, there will be in the coming days, if not weeks, opportunity to actually review the full report online. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics of the focus groups. We're going to summarize the focus group findings, discuss some recommendations that were informed by focus groups, and then we'll spend a really good portion of our time addressing any questions that you actually might have about the process. And so again, for those of you who are just now joining us, we encourage you to actually type in your questions using that Q&A function. And then towards the end of our presentation, we're going to make sure that we make time to address the questions that have been submitted throughout the presentation, as well as the ones that might be live. Right. And so I think we can actually skip the next slide because we won't be using the raise hand feature since we're in webinar mode. But again, we will use the Q&A box to move forward. So I'm going to jump straight into the demographics. And so we talked about this report summarizing focus group findings that were conducted over a 2-month period in the months of the year 2020. And so again, the participants met the following criteria for inclusion. They had to self-identify as a racial ethnic minority. They had to be currently working as a behavioral healthcare professional at one of the 40 community service boards, behavioral healthcare authorities, training centers, or state hospitals in the state of Virginia. Another set of criteria is that they had to have at least 1 or more years of professional experience, also a willingness to actually engage in the conversation online while it was actually being recorded, as well as to talk about issues of race, and again, having accessibility to internet connection as well as Zoom access. And so there was a set of criteria that was actually put in place in order to actually try to identify the most rich cases moving forward, right? And so what we actually see in the slide here is just a little bit of the demographics. We see that there were recruitment emails that were actually used to identify 64 participants who actually took part in the focus group. Participants represented relatively diverse racial and ethnic minority groups. The majority was individuals who self-identify as Black, Afro-Caribbean or African Americans, 49 of those individuals. Our Hispanic and Latino population represented 4, North American, Middle Eastern, or um, Arab Americans represented 2, and then our individuals who self-identified as multiracial, so people who identify with 2 or more races was 8, right? The majority of the participants were actually native born to the United States, 51 out of the 64. Most participants actually identified as female, so 56 females, 7 males, and 1 participant actually identified as non-binary gendered queer. So again, it's important also, I think, to think about the number of experiences. And so the mean in terms of the average of years of experiences as behavioral healthcare professionals in multiple settings was 11 years. Oftentimes, on average, participants had been at their agencies, training centers, or either hospitals for at least 3.5 years. There was several different types of demographics in terms of the type of organizations. The overwhelming majority of our participants, actually, I believe 46 out of the 64, were employed currently at community service boards. The next population was actually those who were part of behavioral health authorities. And then we had at least 6 of our participants who actually were part of state hospitals. I'm going to move forward. In terms of our participants, they actually lived and worked in diverse geographical regions within the state of Virginia, and that includes Northern Virginia, who had the majority in terms of 22 out of our 64 participants. Next was a Tidewater area, then the Central Virginia area with 11, Jefferson had 6, Southwest and Northwestern regions of the state of Virginia each came in with 5. And again, we talked about the employment in terms of where a majority of the participants were actually from in terms of occupations. Most were, in terms of their positions, were therapists / clinicians. So this was 32 out of the 64, followed by 12 case managers, at least 8 individuals who self-identified as program directors or coordinators, 4 social workers, 4 behavioral health nurses, and 4 rehabilitation counselors. And again, majority of the participants actually held a master's degree, followed by a bachelor's degree, a doctorate at 5, a high school degree or equivalent, and then an associate's degree. And again, there were others, at least 4, who actually had another form of credentialing, which included a practical like nurse diploma. Right? Most participants held credentials as qualified mental health professionals, 27 out of the 64, followed by social workers, licensed professional counselors, national certified counselors and social workers, registered nurses, and at least 5 actually participated as others. And so again, a full breakdown of the demographic variables or identifiers of participants will actually be available with the full focus groups. Just a few things with the procedures of it, and again, this is information will be actually available to you, that a firm consultant actually partner with representatives of DBHDS to actually develop an email list to recruit research participants. Special efforts were actually made to recruit behavioral health care professionals of color at least one of the 40 community service boards, behavioral health authorities, training centers, or state hospitals in the state of Virginia. Before the actual interview process, participants actually completed a brief online survey about their demographic characteristics and work experiences, availability, and even information about their willingness to participate in a recorded focus group interview. The reason that the interview was actually focus group is because that was a part of our data analysis. And so what happened was the focus groups, which lasted anywhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours, were actually transcribed verbatim at the conclusion. Those transcriptions were then used to form what we would consider narrative analysis. And so we actually used a qualitative method, what's called thematic coding, where we actually looked at the transcripts across the 10 different focus groups to identify what were the common themes, patterns, in terms of what participants were basically communicating as it relates to barriers and facilitators of both recruitment and retention of behavioral healthcare professionals of color within the state of Virginia. In terms of the data analysis process, as well as some of those logistics around the focus group like themes, again, that's very much available in their full out report. what I really want to focus on in the time that we actually have today is thinking about what we saw in terms of the analysis, and then not just only the analysis, but also what are the recommendations to move forward. And then again, we'll conclude with the questions and answers. So what we saw is that there was three main themes and some sub-themes that actually developed. Again, there were 64 participants, and so in order to actually qualify as a theme, there had to be at least half of the participants or more who actually identify that as an area in terms of actually going through the focus group transcripts. Um, and I think I have that next to pull up for you all. All right. And so the first main theme in terms of the finest we actually saw were described as institutional related retention barriers. And so participants actually reported institutional level barriers to retention across many focus groups, such as discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices, inequitable opportunities, biases within the agency. They were actually based on race or gender. Again, these biases that also routinely produce racial inequalities or inequitable outcomes for behavioral healthcare professionals of color. And again, provided advances for individuals who self-identified as white, right? So within this first main theme, one of the things that I neglected to say is that when you actually review the full report, you also get an opportunity to actually review the 7 questions that were asked to all focus groups across, again, the 10 participating focus groups. So within this first theme, under the umbrella of institutional related retention barriers, there were 5 sub-themes that actually emerged, which we'll go over momentarily. Non-competitive salaries were seen as an institutional related retention barriers, racial disparities in pay, a failure to actually invest in employee development, a lack of diversity, equity, inclusion, accountability, and policies, and race-based glass ceiling and promotion discrimination. So what I want to do is actually just take a moment with each of these slides to define the actual theme so that you know a little bit about what it is. When you actually see the full report, you'll see several quotes that actually correspond with the report so you can get a sense of how that thing was actually developed. Another thing that I think is important in terms of when we're looking at qualitative analysis and issues of trustworthiness and credibility, that there were a few things that were put in place to make sure that the themes were actually credible. And so one of the things we did was actually engage in a process called member check-in. And so once the focus groups were actually transcribed, we actually then sent it out to participants to verify that this is indeed what they actually said. Once we actually got that verification, we went through a process of, again, analyzing the data and developing themes and sub-themes. Once those themes and sub-themes were developed, again, we sent it back out to participants to say, do these themes and sub-themes reflect what you all shared in terms of your focus group experience? And so again, as a way of what we would consider member check-in, right? So our first thing was non-competitive salaries. Across many of the focus groups, participants discussed how low base salaries and inadequate benefit packages were seen as an underlying cause for, again, low retention rates among behavioral healthcare professionals of color, right? In particular, participants reported being underpaid, taken for granted, and oftentimes exploited as employees, right? And so this is one of the main themes that actually came up in terms of what are some of the barriers to actually retaining behavioral healthcare professionals of color. And you can actually read the quote on your own. This person actually talks about when you're actually dependent upon something as your primary source of income and it doesn't meet, you're kind of forced to actually look for other things and find other jobs. This person also goes on to say that what they're finding now is that not only are they being underpaid, but also they're actually being asked to sign disclosures saying that they won't actually work outside of their agency, right? And so again, putting people in really hard positions, which is leading to kind of high attrition rates among behavioral healthcare professionals of color. Right? And again, I'm going to give you an opportunity to kind of read the slide in terms of the quote. We saw that a second main theme under that umbrella of institutional related retention barriers, that there was racial disparities in pay. In all focus groups, participants discussed racial pay gaps for behavioral healthcare professionals of color at all levels. So this included those who were working in the CSBs, those who were working in state hospitals, as well as those who were working in behavior authority agencies, right? Specifically, participants actually discussed that in comparison to their white coworkers, behavioral healthcare professionals of color did not receive the same pay for the same job with the same success and experience. And so this was another recurrent theme and pattern over time. There are actually numbers associated with this when you read the full report, so you can see out of 64 how many of the participants or the focus groups actually aligned or talked about this theme. Right. A few more before we get into our second set of main themes in terms of what we found. Right. Third one was actually failure to invest in employee development. So many participants, again, talked about their agencies or departments or programs' inability or unwillingness to actually invest in their development, right? And that being actually a big reason that behavioral healthcare professionals of color chose to leave, right? So for many, choosing not to invest in providers' training and development were actually resulted in lower chances of actually attracting and retaining racial and ethnic diverse talents, right? And again, I believe the comments that are illustrated in the slide deck actually kind of illustrates this point to a little bit, where this person actually talks about being required or asked to have or to obtain a certain certification, but there was no financial funds or incentives to actually help them to not only obtain that certification, but also actually maintain it over the course of their time, right? And so again, those certifications add up, which again seem to be a compounded issue on top of lower pay for a lot of these behavioral healthcare professionals, right? I'll give you another second or so to kind of look at that quote before we move on. Right. And again, please feel free at any point to type in a question to your Q&A icon, and we'll address those towards the end. Right. The next thing we saw in terms of a main theme that actually kind of stood out was kind of this lack of accountability and policies that were actually related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. That was really a prominent theme that kind of emerged in all 10 of the focus groups, where participants actually discussed that many agencies and departments claim that diversity and inclusion efforts have been kind of top priorities for years, but making real progress had been slow or non-existent. So participants reported that their agencies tended to actually lack accountability for progress, right? There were little measures tied to them and no formal policies to support diversity, equity, and inclusion related efforts, right? And this actually bleeded into how the culture of a lot of these agencies became toxic, according to our participants, right? So again, the lack of accountability and policies related to diversity, equity, and inclusion related efforts or initiatives was really a big hindrance in terms of retention issues. You have two different quotes there. One talks about it from a human resource perspective, I believe, in terms of voicing concerns about unfair treatment because of race and going through the proper channels, but again, nothing actually happening, no accountability there, outside of actually potential retaliation. The top one talks about, again, the lack of, again, adequate staff and financial resources to create programs, creatives, and incentives, or at least initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion related concepts. All right, the last thing something we found under the larger theme of institutional-based retention barriers was kind of what was described as race-based glass ceiling and promotion discrimination. So across all focus groups, respondents discussed, right, employee discrimination issues that prevented behavioral healthcare professionals of color from competing for mid to senior level management roles within agencies. Black women in particular reported that, again, found it most difficult to kind of break the glass ceiling because they live at the intersection of, two historically minoritized groups, being women as well as identifying as Black, Indigenous, or persons of color, right? And so I believe in the quote that you actually see a person making an observation in terms of not really noticing many individuals in leadership position being or self-identify as individuals of color, right? And this was, again, a very consistent theme across the 10 different agencies, or excuse me, focus groups that we actually reviewed. Right, so give you a second to kind of finish up that one before we get into our second main theme and the sub themes that actually flows under it. All right. So the next main theme was cultural related barriers. So again, the first theme talked about the institutional variables that actually played a role in poor retention among behavioral healthcare professionals of color. This next theme kind of speaks to culture-related barriers. So these are the culture of agencies, programs, and departments. And again, participants actually reported these culture level barriers to retention across many of the focus groups. Uh, they talked about many of the ongoing and recurrent acts of racism and discrimination within the respective agencies, programs. Again, mostly against Black providers, which again pushed some to actually think about taking up career options that are totally different from what they're currently doing. And so I want to get into some of those, which you see there: excessive performance monitoring, unfair workloads and work expectations, experiences of microaggressions, race evasiveness in workplaces, tokenism, a lack of critical consciousness among leadership as well as colleagues, as well as, again, a lack of racial literacy, which we'll define in a moment, as well as the invisible wounds of racial trauma. So again, the culture, the climate of these CSBs, these state hospital departments, as well as the other spaces in which behavioral healthcare professionals of color actually occupy. They talked about the invisible impact of like the wounds of like receiving or being a part of those environments and actually the racial trauma that actually is associated with it. Right. So I'm gonna jump into our first one, which actually looks at excessive performance monitoring, where participants actually report receiving excessive, routine, and oftentimes unnecessarily intrusive monitoring from their supervisors and bosses across many of the focus groups, right? Meaning that small mistakes were more likely to be caught, leading to worse performance reviews, lower wages over time, and even job loss, right? And as you actually see in this quote, a person talks about this plantation mentality where you have a lot of your frontline workers and service providers who are kind of being scrutinized and excessively monitored and evaluated by, again, upper to middle management, which oftentimes happen to be individuals who self-identify as white, right? And again, and the result of that causing people to not actually want to come to work or feeling that they're not really supported, but instead being micromanaged, right? And again, when you read the full report, you'll see 3 to 5 quotes per theme to kind of support the themes, right? And again, it was hard to select quotes out of so many in terms of the transcripts. A few more, then again, we'll kind of spend some time really unpacking some potential recommendations. We also saw there was what we titled unfair workload and work expectations. And so again, many of the participants talked about unfair caseloads and work expectations, particularly for behavioral healthcare professionals of color. And again, I think the sub-theme that you actually see there in terms of the quote kind of highlights that, where they talked about actually having to provide services to clients who had more severe needs, having to provide services to clients who identified as racial and ethnic minorities, again, in comparison to their white peers or white counterparts who had less strict workloads, who had clients who actually had less severe conditions actually coming into whether it's the hospital setting or a CSB setting, or again, a behavioral healthcare agency authority setting moving forward. And again, it wasn't just the workload, but also work expectations were a part of that as well, right? Maybe a second or so, just to kind of to review that quote. Our next finding dealt with microaggressions, and again, all focus group participants actually discussed the various daily experiences dealing with racial microaggressions in the workplace from both colleagues as well as clients, right? And so the racial microaggressions behavioral healthcare professionals of color reported included kind of facing daily ranges from being labeled as hard to work with to continually having to be the kind of the point person to educate their white colleagues on kind of all multicultural related topics, regardless of the content, on top of kind of managing their actual day-to-day responsibilities and roles within the agency, right? And so, as you see in some of the quotes, the very first one talks about experiencing a lot of microaggressions that kind of go unchecked, and oftentimes are actually not were safeguarded or actually made excuses for those microaggressions, as well as individuals who again have more passive, inappropriate statements that again oftentimes get dismissed or covered up. And so again, when you think about microaggressions, which again, those verbal or nonverbal behaviors or slights that, again, whether they're intentional or not, communicate that some aspects of a person's identity or social group membership is less valued or yeah, is less value for lack of a better word, right? And so again, these are like thinking about the cumulative effects of microaggressions over time actually add up and have strong correlations to, we'll find out a little bit later, issues with depression, anxiety, work intrusiveness, lack of commitment to organizations. And so again, there's a lot of um, research that kind of supports the negative impact of microaggressions over time. Right? In addition to microaggressions, what we also saw was, or what was also discussed, is that in all focus groups, participants discussed this term of like race evasiveness, right? That they didn't really have safe spaces to talk about race and racism at work, even if race and racism was actually impacting some of the clients that they saw, right? They felt that their colleague kind of actively and intentionally avoided really substantive discussions or even the acknowledgement of race and its connection to issues such as white supremacy, power, and privilege, right? And again, I believe this quote kind of talks to that a little bit in terms of having a leadership who are open to discussing other societal and social issues, whether that's via email or through large group meetings. However, when the topic of race would come up, or racism, that they were less apt to actually address those issues, right? And so again, that caused perceptions of unsafe spaces to actually have these real dialogues moving forward. Right, I want to give you a segment to kind of finish up that quote before we move forward. Right. The next one is kind of tokenism, which is kind of interrelated to some of the other themes, sub-themes that you saw. So across many focus groups, participants reported that they were often asked to educate their colleagues on issues of racism and other isms, right? They were oftentimes the one who were tasked with recruiting more diverse candidates. They were oftentimes tapped to speak up in uncomfortable discussions about company culture. So in short, they were the ones who were actually doing the hard work of making the workplace more diverse, more inclusive and welcoming. And again, that obligation, that responsibility, which oftentimes is referred to as hidden labor, oftentimes actually competed with the demands of their other roles and responsibilities within the agency, right? And so again, they were engaging in these topics or in these roles without additional time or without additional pay, as well as these things weren't actually really being evaluated in terms of their performance evaluation, which oftentimes was actually associated with merit pay or raises moving forward, right? So again, as you see in the quote that you might have actually completed, the person talks about actually not having a leadership position, but being asked to like facilitate book groups and to actually lead these conversations. Again, on top of their regular day-to-day responsibilities. So kind of filling a kind of tokenism as they were actually placed in those positions. And again, this was actually a theme that was consistent across many of the 10 focus groups that we actually ran. Okay. Again, another second to kind of finish up that quote. The next one we saw was what we titled a lack of critical consciousness among leadership and coworkers. So across many of the focus groups, the participants actually noted that what contributes to kind of a poor racial climate at work was actually the managers and their supervisors' inability to kind of critically reflect on their own assumptions, prejudices, biases, or points of views, or kind of recognize and analyze the racial climate of the agency, right? So again, this is whether it was a program or department within a state hospital, within, again, authorities, agencies, or even within CSBs. That again, in terms of leadership, which oftentimes largely reflected um, individuals who self-identified as white. That again, there was an inability or critical consciousness, which is really a critical awareness of forms of injustice, a critical awareness of, again, racial climates, and again, how it may be impacting the workers as well as the clients and the communities that are actually being served. And again, these conversations never came up. And again, there was really no efforts to actually address it. And again, these were all kind of the barriers that they believed, and they being participants believe actually led to some of the higher turnover rates that we actually see in the state of Virginia in terms of behavioral healthcare professionals. Again, I'm going to give you a second to review that. Again, if you have questions, thoughts, comments, please feel free to throw that into the Q&A box. And then at the end, we're going to have some discussion around that. A few more, and then we'll conclude with recommendations. And this is very much tied to it, where we define this one as racially illiterate colleagues. And again, across most focus groups, participants described a lack of knowledge, skill, awareness, and dispositions among many of their colleagues. This included senior to mid-level management and supervisors to discuss issues of race and racism, right? And again, this is not only issues that are happening in the society, but also as they think about serving predominantly Black and Brown communities, thinking about how race and issues of race and racism actually impacts those communities, how initiatives need to actually address some of those concerns. But again, there was kind of like not knowing how to talk about it. And so it would just kind of bleed back into that race evasiveness where we just don't talk about it, right? We kind of go out of our way to actually have those conversations, right? And so again, we'll give you a second to kind of review those quotes. Again, as you see in the very first quote, again, I normally don't read quotes, but I'll read that one that this person actually said that when you're looking out and you're not seeing people, and we have to start to have those conversations, and all of a sudden it kind of becomes uncomfortable in the meeting when you start to bring it up, and it being issues of race and racism or even the racial climate. You realize that again, when having this conversation, there's a lot of fumbling around, people trying to be very politically correct. It's not really a safe space to have those conversations, right? I believe there's other quotes that talk about participants actually being encouraged in those spaces to talk more broadly about issues of like culture or issues of social justice and not focus on race, because it could actually be uncomfortable for some of their white peers and colleagues, right? So we saw this as a consistent thing across different focus groups. And so it really all kind of, I guess it culminated into what we consider to be like these invisible wounds of racial trauma. And we saw across all the focus groups that respondents discussed that there was like these physiological and psychological strains enacted on many of the behavioral healthcare professionals who participated in the focus groups in terms of the amount of energy they actually spent dealing with or coping with racial microaggressions or even these instances of racism within the agencies, whether they're on an institutional level or within the culture, right? The policies, practices, and procedures of agencies. And again, these strains were actually said to lead to burnout and high turnover rates among many of the behavioral healthcare professionals of color. And one of the things that was really interesting is that through these focus groups, many of the behavioral healthcare professionals of color were actually pretty transparent, saying that a lot of these issues that they're actually talking about is the reason that they're currently on the market or they're currently actually looking to actually move into positions outside of, again, the public sector, particularly within the state of Virginia. And so if we were to actually switch gears before we got into recommendations, one of the things we saw that there were recruitment barriers that came up in terms of what are some of the barriers that are actually preventing the onboarding of more behavioral healthcare professionals of color. And we saw that there were three sub-themes that came out. One being what was identified as bias in the hiring process. The second one being the agency's reputation. And the last one being kind of these unintentional outreach efforts, right? So I'm going to quickly go through those, and then we'll get into the recommendations before we address some of the questions that you actually might have. So the first one we saw, and I'll give you the opportunity to kind of read that quote, was bias in the hiring process. And that kind of emerged as a prominent theme in all the focus group interviews. So as you see, this person talks about not really buying into the concept that there aren't enough qualified people who are interested, but however, there's biases in the process, right? And so how people are selected, how they're recruited, again, all kind of come with what we see as standard biases within workplaces. So again, this isn't necessarily unique to the state of Virginia or CSBs or state hospitals or other places where behavioral healthcare professionals of work actually, where they're actually employed, but we see that this is actually pretty consistent when we look at literature in terms of employment and workplace biases in the hiring process. Second part we saw was the agency's reputation. So if you think back to those institutional and cultural related barriers to retention, that actually creates these narratives that again have a negative impact on the ability of these agencies to actually recruit other employees of color. So again, the reputation of agencies and its treatment of employees of color kind of emerged as a very prominent theme in the focus groups related to the low numbers of behavioral healthcare professionals of color who actually enter public sector sectors in Virginia, right? And again, as you see, this one participant says that they think that the reputation of the agencies and how they treat staff, again, is a part of the problem. And it's really hard to kind of promote the agency and talk about it being a place that's actually both very culturally sensitive and very safe to work, because that's not really always the case. The last barrier we see is just kind of these unintentional outreach efforts. And so again, across all focus groups, respondents kind of reported these unintentional outreach efforts by agencies, departments, and services within DBHDS, and that being part of the contributing factor to the low numbers of behavioral healthcare professionals of color who actually see entering into the public sector. And so again, I'll just allow you to kind of take a moment to review that quote. Which again talks about the importance of actually having intentional, purposeful strategies to actually not only attract but to again retain behavioral healthcare professionals of color, right? And so I know that was a lot of information shared in a relatively short period of time. I really strongly encourage you to, when it becomes available, to actually read the full out report, to read the multiple quotes that actually go with the report, to kind of contextualize some of the findings that we actually see across the 10 focus groups, right? And so as we conclude, I want to talk about some recommendations. So I think it's important to highlight, or to at least acknowledge that, again, the findings discussed so far in this presentation, I think it really highlights the complex and dynamic role of race, ethnicity, and culture in the retention and recruitment of behavioral healthcare professionals of color, particularly those who are working in public sector service sectors in the state of Virginia. Nonetheless, I think it's important to note that many of the negative racial experiences that were discussed in this presentation and what you will read in the report are very similar to findings in the broader cultural competencies and multicultural health literature nationwide. So therefore, themes that actually suggest racism and bias and discrimination are not unique to DBHDS. I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that. Instead, they mirror social patterns that have challenged healthcare and the United States culture in general and for generations, right? So again, even though that's the case, still the negative racial experiences discussed in this presentation, which you'll read in the report, I think presents or represents a critical call to action. And so in all focus groups, respondents had the opportunities to offer a range of interrelated recommendations to improve the retention and recruitment of behavioral healthcare professionals of color, particularly those who are in the public sector within the state of Virginia. Those recommendations are actually going to be described in the next few slides. And while all the recommendations may not actually be feasible to implement now, I believe some likely represent low-hanging fruit that can be implemented with limited system effort or cost. To further kind of evolve and prioritize, I think, participants' recommendations, it is my recommendation, and this is actually available in the report, that there should be actually an anti-racist, or there should be consideration around an anti-racist steering committee and subcommittees formed to actually address some of these recommendations. And those committees can actually consist of DBHDS members, individuals also who are invited to join a subcommittee could actually be behavioral healthcare professionals of color, clients, community stakeholders, and relevant individuals from, again, executive leadership. So again, I want to walk through what I believe to be 18 recommendations. And again, as we're going through recommendation or as you're reflecting upon what was been shared so far, I want to give you the opportunity and strongly encourage you to ask any questions that you might have in the Q&A. And again, just with the understanding that the conclusion of this presentation, the process has actually already been underway to actually make the full report public. And so you have access to that, those of you who haven't seen the report yet. Right, so a few recommendations I want to kind of highlight, and then I want to open it up, and I believe that Glencore will actually join me for the Q&A portion of it, or at least have announcements. One recommendation was to actually make a specific, measurable, and public commitment to improve the representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color at all agency staff, across all agencies, staffing levels, especially those who are in senior leadership and middle management positions, right? So when we talk about those low-hanging fruit, this can be actually considered one of them, right? Making a really specific, measurable, and public commitment to kind of improve representation at all agency, staff, and levels, right? The second one is actually creating a transparent process to actually advance behavioral healthcare providers or professionals of color, advancing them into actually leadership roles. And so one of the things that can be considered is kind of creating formal and informal mentor, coaching and sponsorship programs to kind of recognize that diverse teams require diverse management skills. And so looking for ways to actually increase opportunities to build current behavioral healthcare professionals of color, their leadership and management capacity, right? And so the goal should be to propel racial and ethnic behavioral healthcare providers upward career mobility and increase diverse hires in leadership and middle management positions, right? So this is going beyond recruiting for kind of these first frontline service worker positions, which again are very important, but also thinking about how do we actually start to create pathways to leadership position and upper and senior level management. Right. Another low-hanging fruit that I think is worth consideration is tracking and publicly reporting workforce diversity data annually to kind of create a sense of accountability for community service boards, health authorities, training centers, and state hospital in terms of the programs. And so again, one of the things that you can consider is creating what I would consider, or I would call initially, kind of a Virginia DB/HDS diversity and inclusion scorecard or dashboard that I think could help really accomplish this task. And this is again thinking about involving senior leaders in determining diversity and inclusion metrics that will raise their collective accountability for its success and kind of ensure that diversity and inclusion strategies directly enables agencies to kind of meet those goals. And so again, thinking about are there report cards, or there scorecards or dashboards that can be used to help kind of monitor the movement or traction in HDS in terms of diversity and inclusion related goals, right? And making this published. And again, this is also somewhat of a low-hanging fruit that actually requires this thinking about what data is actually being collected across service providers and agencies in the state of Virginia. How might you actually use that, whether it's at a large level, at the state level, at a regional level, or even within the individual departments or organizations. Right, a few more. Conducting internal research to identify possible bias areas, right? And determining what metrics can actually be used to measure change and then make those small changes. And so we're talking about small steps, which are oftentimes called bias interrupters, right? To kind of curb the unconscious bias effects, right? This is about, again, disaggregating internal staff data to identify the areas where racial disparities exist, such as compensation or promotion, then analyzing the data to find the root causes of those racial disparities, right? And so this is thinking about kind of these internal audits that can be done to actually identify potential areas of biases or red flags moving forward. The fifth one we see is actually creating an accountability plan. This is, again, using regular surveys to check in on your progress and having a plan in place for how you're going to ensure the staff upholds diversity, equity, and inclusion related policies, right? Requiring all leaders to be active participants in agencies' diversity and inclusion initiatives, and tying the success in those initiatives to annual performance reviews and considerations for merit pay, I believe is actually warranted. Right? Other things that we see is create, fund, and support what we call employee research groups. I know there's some agencies that already are doing this. And again, doing this for behavioral healthcare professionals of color. And again, these employee research groups are oftentimes identified, or employee identity or experience-based groups that kind of build communities. And so these what we would consider ERGs, or sometimes known as affinity groups or diversity groups. And generally, again, the purpose is actually to build community, to provide support, and kind of contribute to personal and professional development in the work environment, right? So the program really facilitates a clear communication line from ERGs to leadership. And so these groups can actually be used as a bridge between members in the agency or in the program and their communication to leadership, right, moving forward, right? In terms of actually being able to actually identify issues, needs, and policies that need to be put in place. Okay. A few more, then we'll conclude with our last slide of recommendations. One is thinking about audit agency policies and culture. And one of the things that you'll see in the full report is that I provide a list of instruments that are actually specific to the healthcare field in terms of audits that actually can be done within agencies, right? No matter how big or small. And so again, I strongly encourage you to consult with the report as it relates to that. This is again thinking about audits and auditing agency policies and culture to ensure that the work environment is more equitable and inclusive to diverse backgrounds and perspective. Fostering, I believe, an inclusive workplace culture is it's a complex task, and it must be continuously maintained to ensure that the retention of behavioral healthcare professionals of color. I believe this approach really allows workplaces to kind of review and plan for improved practice across various organizational functions. And so I believe auditing diversity practice kind of helps avoid those quick fix solutions that we oftentimes are kind of prone to, and enables meaningful change by gathering accurate data, right, about organizational strengths as well as areas of improvement, and convincing again managers that again a problem exists. Oftentimes, one of the things that I oftentimes say in a lot of the workshops and reports is that how do you address a problem that you don't know exists? Well, you don't, right? And so again, thinking about organizational assessments actually provides the means to kind of establish not only identification of the problem, but also organizational accountability, right? It provides a framework for really planning and allocating resources. Again, please consult with the full report, which gives you examples of tools that you actually can use to accomplish this task. Two more on this page. One is create a kind of incentive funds, right, to encourage and help behavioral healthcare professionals of color at all levels earn credentials, certification, licensure, and even continuing education credits. Offering training and educational subsidies is kind of considered a valuable retention and recruitment tool, particularly for job-related courses and training to better prepare workers for their current and possible future roles, right? So as we think about earlier to some of those recommendations in terms of building the leadership capacity of members who are actually a part of your agencies, right? And so again, I oftentimes see uh, credentials and this type of support. It's kind of a win-win for behavioral healthcare providers as well as the agencies themselves. The last one that we see, at least on this page, is creating a strategic outreach plan for recruiting Black, Indigenous, and people of color into these positions. And so again, behavioral healthcare providers should reflect the increasing diversity of the communities being served, right? And so recruitment efforts, which includes search processes, should actually focus on increasing the diversity of the application pool, which in turn help increase the number of diverse hires and broadens kind of the talent reserve at current agencies, right? All right, and I believe the last slide I have before we get into the Q&A, which I'm hoping that you're loading up the Q&A question box with questions that we can actually address, is expanding residency and internship programs to attract potential racial and ethnic diverse candidates who have transferable skills, who may not be taking more traditional educational paths towards the mental health field, right? So thinking about how we can actually increase the funding and the support of like internship programs to provide people kind of opportunity to kind of see what the field is actually like, right? Creating a strategic plan for retaining behavioral healthcare professionals, right? This is again thinking about developing initiatives such as mentoring and formal leadership programs that provide support and professional growth and advancement for behavioral healthcare professionals of color at all levels. So again, agencies can kind of leverage existing systems for their annual staff reviews to kind of identify career advancement opportunities and underscore retention efforts. Right? Another one that I think is really important to consider, or at least it's worth considering, is implementing more robust offboarding, right, exit interview processes to kind of learning in order to learn why behavioral healthcare professionals of color, why they're resigning, and again, this can actually improve internal culture, and again, provides you with some really rich data to talk about why you see such high trends of behavioral healthcare professionals of color leaving, again, state kind of sanction opportunities or employment within DBHDS. Right? So again, thinking about how we might use interview data or exit interview data to actually identify potential problems and And by identifying it, we can actually provide more targeted solutions. Right? Uh, a few more recommendations as we kind of think about concluding for this section is to kind of evaluate and replace um, HR operational practices using a more equity policy lens, right? One that actually recognizes the differences in quality performances of cultural perceptions. And examples of operational practices to review could include job evaluations, improvement plans, reward bonuses, pay equity, pay transparencies, opportunities to develop career paths, such as like stretch assignments, right? And so again, thinking about how HR services can actually be modified with more of an equity policy lens. And the next one really kind of bleeds into that in terms of operating or offering comprehensive employee benefits, right, at all levels, especially for frontline service providers. And this is again thinking about creating a package that offers all kind of the general expected benefits, include healthcare coverage, paid time off, dental coverage, retirement packages. And again, important to kind of really recognize that workforce providers at different stages have different needs. However, again, thinking about how you can actually use comprehensive employment benefits as an opportunity to attract and retain, again, behavioral healthcare professionals of color. We see that also it's important to think about providing sensitivity training. So again, continuous sensitivity training to create a better workplace culture. And again, this sensitivity training can actually help employees kind of um, their values, to view differences, to understand the words and actions and how it might be offensive. And again, thinking about going beyond what oftentimes it was identified in focus groups as these mandatory diversity trainings, which you could actually answer the question at the end of these trainings without ever actually having to go through the trainings. And so thinking about something that's more continuous over time that allows people to develop the racial literacy that we talked about earlier, to develop the critical consciousness, to develop skills to actually interrupt microaggressions. And so again, more meaningful trainings moving forward. Okay. So I believe we have two more. One would be to revisit non-discriminatory policies, and again, thinking about code of conducts that are actually more related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, as well as periodically training employees on the contents and kind of making sure that you follow up and enforce it. And so, when you're thinking about non-discriminatory policies, making sure that they actually include what we consider to be a clear explanation of prohibited conduct, including examples. It should actually include clear assurance that employees who actually make complaints or provide information related to complaints will be protected against retaliation. These policies should actually include a description of the complaint process that provides multiple accessible avenues for complaints. This should also include assurance that employers um, will protect the confidentiality of harassment complaints to the extent possible that they can, as well as other things as it relates to kind of prompt, thorough, and impartial investigations of those complaints. And so again, the full out list of recommendations related to that point is actually provided. The last two focused on leadership performance. And so again, policies that recognize and respond to a diverse workforce, various needs are necessary. And again, they're also powerful tools for actually attracting other behavioral healthcare professionals of color. However, they're actually less effective at retaining diverse talent without, again, an equal focus on leadership that's required to actually foster an inclusive organizational culture, right? So it's really the daily experiences and stories of a workforce that actually defines the culture. And again, it's the role of leaders to kind of shape the required culture through their actions and interactions with others. And so again, this requires training, and this requires again a skill set that again may or may not actually be there. So thinking about how that can be supported. And then the very last one is really championing the mental health and well-being of people in the workforce. Thinking about work-life balance is really essential aspect of a healthy environment, but also thinking about how do you might actually assess and check in on the mental health of the providers that work. And so again, this could be established through employee assistance programs that are generally there to actually provide benefits such as counseling services for your counselors. Again, think about how you can actually document more culturally responsive and culturally intensive resources and support for behavioral healthcare professionals of color. So thinking about again, dealing with workplace cultures, dealing with societal issues, dealing with client issues that again it provides a lot of stress and anxiety. And again, thinking about how you actually can consider self-care to be a priority and develop opportunities for members of marginalized groups who actually work as behavioral healthcare professionals to be able actually to seek safe spaces, to be able to seek counseling resources, which actually can help provide them with again the mental space necessary to actually do their work uh, more, I think, effectively moving forward. Right. And so again, we spent the last, I think, close to 60 minutes talking about a lot of different um, themes that we actually found in the report, as well as some potential recommendations. Now, this is a time where I kind of wanted to shift the focus a little bit. Again, thank you for sitting through kind of a 60-minute webinar where I spent most of the time talking to you. But I also want to kind of transition into thinking about what are some of the questions or even reactions or observations that you actually have. I want to make sure that we address that. And so at this time, I invite you to actually to continue to use the Q&A icon to submit your questions. And while you do that, I believe Glencora will be joining us to not only moderate it, but she also may be able to actually address some of the questions as well.